What she bought wasn't for herself. The words lingered in Ethan Cole's mind as he stood alone in the dim glow of his penthouse office. The Manhattan skyline stretching endlessly beyond the glass walls. A city built on ambition, deals, and carefully crafted illusions. A world he had mastered yet no longer trusted. Because somewhere along the way, every smile had started to feel rehearsed, every connection transactional, every "I care about you" quietly tied to the weight of his net worth. And tonight, as he stared down at the cold, digital list of transactions on his screen, something didn't add up, because out of 4 black cards, each with no limit, each capable of buying anything from a $50,000 watch to a private jet charter, one had been used in a way that didn't belong in his world. Not here, not in the polished rhythm of luxury and excess, not in a game he had designed to expose truth, because this was supposed to be simple, predictable even, for women, 48 hours, unlimited spending, and one clear outcome. Proof that money reveals who people really are. That was the theory, the experiment. The reason he had called them into his home just 2 nights ago, laying 4 sleek black cards across the marble table like pieces on a chessboard, watching their eyes light up in different ways, curiosity, excitement, calculation, and then there was her, Amara Johnson, standing slightly behind the others in her simple uniform, hands still faintly damp from polishing glass surfaces, unsure if she was even meant to be there, and that hesitation, that quiet pause, had almost gone unnoticed. Almost, because Ethan noticed everything. It was how he built his empire, how he stayed ahead, how he survived in a world where trust was a liability. And yet even he hadn't expected what would come next, because now, as the numbers scrolled before him, he could see the pattern clearly. Chloe Bennett, $18,000 in designer boutiques within the first 6 hours. Vanessa Reed, a diamond bracelet charged before midnight. Olivia Hayes, high-end dinners and strategic reservations with names that opened doors. Exactly what he expected, exactly what made sense. But Amara's card, the 4th one, the one he almost didn't hand out, showed something else entirely, something that didn't belong in this game. A $2,300 hospital payment in Queens, a $480 grocery purchase in bulk. Quantities, a $1,200 donation to a small shelter in Brooklyn. And then smaller charges, gas, essentials, things no one with access to that level of money would prioritize first. And Ethan leaned back slowly, his jaw tightening not in anger, but in something far more unfamiliar, confusion. Because people didn't do this, not when they could have anything, not when no one was watching, except he was watching, always watching, because that was the point, the cameras, the transaction alerts, the silent observation behind a test that was never meant to be fair, only revealing. And now, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure what he was looking at, because this didn't fit the narrative he believed in, didn't align with the version of the world he had come to accept, where kindness was conditional and generosity came with visibility, where people gave only when it benefited them. But here, in quiet transactions scattered across the city, was something different, something unpolished, uncalculated, and that unsettled him more than any betrayal ever had, because it suggested that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. And Ethan exhaled slowly, eyes returning to the screen, tracing each charge like clues in a story he hadn't meant to read. And somewhere between the numbers and the silence of the room, one thought surfaced, quiet but impossible to ignore. What kind of person is given everything and chooses to give it away? And more importantly, what does that mean for a man who built his entire life believing no one ever would? 48 hours earlier, the room did not feel this quiet. It felt electric, alive with possibility, the kind of charged silence that only comes when people are standing on the edge of something they do not fully understand. Ethan Cole stood at the head of the long marble table, his posture relaxed but deliberate, the city lights behind him casting a faint glow across the polished surface where 4 black cards rested in perfect alignment. And for a moment no one spoke, because everyone in that room knew exactly what those cards meant, even if no one dared to say it out loud. Unlimited access, no ceiling, no restrictions, the kind of power most people only imagined. And Ethan let the silence stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable before he finally spoke, his voice calm, steady. Almost detached, spend it however you want, there are no rules, except one, I want to see who you really are. Chloe Bennett was the first to react, a small, breathless laugh slipping out as she stepped closer, her fingers hovering over the card, as if it might disappear. Vanessa Reed followed, more composed, but her eyes sharp, already calculating possibilities. Olivia Hayes did not move right away. She studied Ethan instead, as if trying to read between the lines, searching for the catch that had to exist. Because nothing in her world was ever this simple. And then there was Amara standing near the far end of the room, half in shadow, her cleaning cloth still tucked into her apron, as though she had not expected to be included at all, her gaze fixed not on the card, but on the distance between herself and the table, like there was an invisible line she was not meant to cross. You two, Ethan said, without looking directly at her, and that was the moment every head turned, because suddenly the room remembered. She was there, the maid. Chloe raised an eyebrow. Vanessa let out a quiet, amused exhale. Olivia simply watched, waiting to see what would happen next. Amara hesitated, her hand tightening slightly around the cloth, before she stepped forward, each movement careful, measured, like she was walking into a space that did not belong to her. I think there must be some mistake, she said softly, her voice steady, but low. There is no mistake, Ethan replied, now meeting her eyes for the first time, and something unreadable passed between them, not kindness, not judgment, something closer to curiosity. Take it. Amara glanced down at the card, its matte black surface reflecting nothing back at her, no hint of warmth, no invitation, just wait. She had spent years learning how to stay invisible in rooms like this, how to move quietly, how to avoid attention, because attention often came with assumptions, and assumptions rarely worked in her favor, and now suddenly, she was being placed at the center of something she did not understand. What is this really for? She asked, and Ethan almost smiled, not because the question surprised him, but because no one else had asked it. Does it matter? He said, and for a second Amara considered that, because in her world it always mattered. There was always a reason, always a consequence, but in his world, maybe there was not. Maybe this was just what power looked like, unpredictable, effortless, indifferent to the rules. She had spent her life following Chloe, had already picked up her card, turning it between her fingers with a grin. Oh, it matters, she said lightly, but not enough to say no. Vanessa slipped hers into her purse. Without hesitation, Olivia finally reached forward, her expression composed but thoughtful, and then there was only one card left. Amara looked at it again, then at Ethan, and something in his expression held steady, not pushing, not pulling, just waiting. And slowly, she set the cloth down on the table beside the card, a small, quiet act that felt louder than anything else in the room. Before she reached out and picked it up, it was heavier than she expected, cool against her fingers, solid in a way that made it feel real, in a way the moment itself did not. What happens when the time is up? She asked, and Ethan answered without pause. You come back here, and we talk about what you chose, not what you bought, what you chose. And that distinction lingered because it sounded simple, but it was not really, because choice meant something different depending on where you started. Chloe was already talking about stores, Vanessa about reservations, Olivia about opportunities, their voices overlapping, filling the room with plans and possibilities. But Amara said nothing. She closed her hand around the card as if testing its weight. Again, as if trying to understand what it meant to hold something that could change everything, and yet did not feel like it belonged to her. And as she stepped back into the quiet space she had occupied before, Ethan watched her, not the others, not the laughter, not the excitement, just her, because something about the way she held that card did not match the way the others did not match the way anyone usually did, and for the first time since he started this, he felt a flicker of something he had not planned for, uncertainty, not about them, but about what he might see when they came back. The first 12 hours passed exactly the way Ethan expected, and that was the problem, because predictability was the one thing he trusted least now. As he stood in front of a quiet wall of screens hidden behind a panel in his office, each display showing fragments of the city filtered through transactions, timestamps, and silent observation, Chloe Bennett moved through Fifth Avenue like she had been waiting her entire life for this moment, her laughter bright, effortless, as she stepped out of a boutique with bags that cost more than most people made in a month, $18,000 gone in under 6 hours, without hesitation, without reflection. Because for her the card was not a question, it was confirmation of who she already believed. She was Vanessa Reed, took a different approach, slower, more deliberate, but no less revealing. She booked a private spa experience reserved weeks in advance, the kind of place where time itself felt expensive, where every detail whispered exclusivity, and by midnight a diamond bracelet rested on her wrist, catching the light like a quiet declaration that She knew exactly how to translate access into status. Olivia Hayes was strategic, every charge mapped to an outcome, reservations at restaurants where deals were made, introductions that could be leveraged, investments disguised as experiences, because in her world money was not for showing off, it was for moving forward, and Ethan watched all of it with the same detached focus, because none of it surprised him, not the speed, not the scale, not even the confidence, because this was the version of truth. He understood people revealed themselves through what they reached for when nothing stopped them, and so far the pattern held perfectly until he looked at the fourth screen and found nothing at first, just a quiet absence where there should have been activity. Amara Johnson had not used the card for the first 6 hours, not once, and that alone caught his attention, because hesitation was rare when temptation was that immediate and that absolute. And as the clock moved forward into the evening, he saw her again, not in a store, not in a restaurant, but on a bus heading downtown, her posture straight, her expression thoughtful, the card still untouched in her bag, like it did not belong to her world. And maybe it did not, because while the others moved easily through spaces designed for spending, Amara moved through places that required something else: awareness, patience, the kind of quiet calculation that came from knowing what it meant to have limits. And even when those limits were removed, the habits remained, because power did not erase perspective, it only revealed how deeply it was rooted. And Ethan leaned closer, slightly narrowing his eyes as he followed her path, not because he expected something dramatic, but because the absence of action had already become its own statement. And then finally, hours later, there was a charge, not large, not flashy, but precise: $240 at a grocery store in Queens, not organic specialty items, not luxury brands, just bulk essentials, rice, canned goods, fresh produce, enough to feed more than one person. And that was when Ethan felt the first shift, not in the data, but in himself, because this was not what people did when they were given freedom like that. They did not start small, they did not think beyond themselves, and yet here, she was doing exactly that, and he watched as she carried the bags herself. No driver, no assistance, walking several blocks before stopping at a modest building where the lights inside were warm and steady, and people moved with a kind of quiet familiarity that spoke of routine, not performance. And when she stepped inside, there were no cameras allowed, no clear view of what happened next, only time passing. And then she emerged empty-handed, the bags gone, replaced by nothing visible except a subtle change in her expression, not relief, not pride, something softer, something internal. And Ethan sat back slowly, his fingers resting against the edge of the desk, because now the pattern was broken, not completely, but enough to matter, enough to raise a question he had not planned to ask. What if the test was not revealing what people were, but what they had always been beneath everything? Money could amplify desire, but it could not create character. And as the hours continued, he saw more of it, small, deliberate choices that did not align with excess: a gas station fill up, not for herself, but for an older car she did not drive, a modest payment at a clinic later that night, each transaction quiet, almost invisible in the scale of what the card could do, but together they formed something far more significant than any single large purchase. And Ethan found himself watching only her now, the other screens fading into background noise, because for the first time since this began, he was not observing for confirmation, he was searching for understanding. And somewhere in the quiet rhythm of her choices, he realized something that unsettled him more than anything else he had seen so far. She was not trying to impress him, she was not trying to win, she was not even trying to prove anything at all. She was simply being who she was, even when no one was supposed to be watching, and that was the one variable he had never accounted for. By the time the city slipped into its second night, the contrast had become impossible to ignore, because while Chloe's laughter echoed through a rooftop lounge overlooking Central Park, where a single evening cost more than a year of rent in most neighborhoods, and Vanessa adjusted the clasp of her bracelet under soft golden lights, as if she had always belonged to that world, and Olivia leaned forward at a private table, discussing numbers and projections with people who measured value in millions. Ethan found himself returning again and again to the same quiet screen where Amara moved through the city, without spectacle, without noise, as if the weight of the card in her pocket had not changed the way she saw the world, but had only given her a different way to respond to it. And sometime after midnight, there was another charge, this one larger, $3,100 at a hospital in Queens, and Ethan leaned forward instantly, because this was the first time the amount itself stood out not for its size, but for its purpose, and he watched the timestamp, the location, the confirmation details unfold across the screen like a story written in numbers, and then the camera outside the building caught her again, stepping through the automatic doors, her pace, steady, her expression, focused, not hurried, not uncertain, just resolved. And there was something in that moment that made Ethan pause, because he recognized that look, not the action, but the certainty behind it, the kind of decision that did not ask for approval and did not wait for validation, the kind of choice people made when they already knew who they were and what mattered more than anything else. And as minutes turned into an hour, he remained there watching the entrance, as if expecting her to come back out immediately. But she did not, and the longer she stayed, the more the question shifted from what she was doing to why she was doing it. Because this was no longer a simple act of generosity, this was commitment, this was time, this was presence, and those were things money alone could not explain. And when she finally reappeared just after 1 a.m, her shoulders were slightly lower, not from exhaustion, but from release. Like something heavy had been set down, and she stepped out into the cool air of the city, pulling her coat tighter around her, as if the night had suddenly become colder, and for a brief second, she stopped, looking up at nothing in particular, just breathing, and Ethan felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, not admiration, not yet, but recognition, because that moment did not belong to his world, it did not belong to transactions or strategy, it belonged to something quieter, something he had not allowed himself to consider in a long time. And as she walked away, the camera followed her for a few blocks until she reached a small 24-hour diner, the kind of place most people passed without noticing, and she stepped inside alone, taking a seat by the window, ordering something simple, a cup of coffee and a sandwich. And when the bill came, she did not use the card, she reached into her own wallet instead, pulling out cash worn, folded like it had been counted carefully before, and Ethan frowned slightly at that, because it did not make sense, not in the logic of the test, not in the logic of unlimited access, and yet there it was, another choice, another quiet decision that did not align with anything he had expected, and he found himself replaying it in his mind, not the action, but the intention, because if the card was meant to remove limits, why was she still holding on to them? Why was she choosing to spend her own money when she did not have to? And the answer did not come immediately, but the question stayed with him as the night stretched on. Because somewhere between what she could do and what she chose to do, there was a line he had never considered before, a boundary that had nothing to do with rules and everything to do with identity. And as the final hours of the test approached, Ethan realized that he was no longer waiting to see what she would buy, he was waiting to understand what she valued. And that shift changed everything, because for the first time since this began, the outcome was no longer obvious, the conclusion no longer certain. And as he stood there in the quiet glow of the screens, watching the city move around her, he understood something he had not planned. For this was no longer his experiment alone, because whatever truth he was uncovering, it was not just about them, it was about him, and whether he was ready to accept what it meant. Morning arrived quietly, but not gently, because the final hours of the test carried a different kind of weight, the kind that did not come from urgency, but from consequence. And as sunlight stretched across the glass walls of Ethan Cole's penthouse, the city below waking into its usual rhythm of movement and noise, he stood once again in front of the screens, not with the same detached certainty as before, but with something far more unsettled. Because now every transaction from Amara felt less like data and more like a decision he was being forced to witness. And sometime just after 7 a.m, there was another charge, not large, not dramatic, but precise, $680 at a small educational office in Brooklyn, and Ethan watched as the receipt details appeared: tuition assistance, partial payment, and he paused, because this was not random, this was intentional, this was part of a pattern that had been building quietly over the last day, a pattern of giving that was not impulsive but deliberate. And when the camera feed picked her up again, she was standing outside the building, speaking to someone older, her posture respectful, her voice calm. And though he could not hear the words, he could see enough to understand the exchange, because the woman in front of her hesitated at first, shaking her head, like she could not accept what was being offered, and Amara did not push, she simply waited, her expression steady, patient, until finally the woman's resistance softened and she nodded slowly. And in that moment something shifted again, not in the transaction, but in the meaning behind it, because this was not about solving a problem quickly, this was about meeting someone where they were, and that required something more than money, it required understanding. And as Amara walked away, she did not look back, She did not linger, she simply moved forward like she always had. Like this was just another part of her day, and Ethan found himself following her again, not out of control, but out of a growing need to understand the logic behind choices that did not follow his rules. And by late morning the contrast reached its peak. Chloe had moved on to a private fitting. Vanessa was finalizing a weekend getaway. Olivia had secured another meeting that could turn into something significant, their worlds expanding exactly as expected, while Amara's world seemed to narrow not in limitation, but in focus, each step grounded, each decision connected to something real. And that was when the final charge appeared, $920 at a small hardware store, and for a moment Ethan frowned because this did not fit the pattern, not immediately, not in the same way as the others. But when the camera caught up to her again, the context became clear. She was carrying supplies not for herself, but for a building that had seen better days, a place where paint had faded and small repairs had been left undone, not because people did not care, but because they could not afford to. And she moved through the space with quiet familiarity, speaking to someone at the entrance, then stepping inside with the kind of ease that came from knowing exactly where she was needed. And Ethan watched as the pieces connected, not all at once, but gradually forming something he could not ignore anymore. Because this was not random generosity, this was a network of care. This was someone who already knew where the gaps were, and when given the means chose to fill them, not for recognition, not for reward, but because that was who she was before any of this began. And as the clock edged closer to the end of the 48 hours, Ethan realized something that unsettled him more than anything else he had seen so far. He had designed this test to reveal truth, but he had assumed that truth would confirm his beliefs. Instead, it was challenging them, breaking them apart in quiet, undeniable ways. And when the final minutes arrived, there were no dramatic purchases, no last-minute splurges, just silence on her account, as if she had already done everything she needed to do. And when the system marked the test as complete, Ethan stepped away from the screens for the first time in hours, the room suddenly feeling larger, quieter, heavier, because now came the part he had been certain about from the beginning, the conclusion, the judgment, the moment where everything would be made clear. And yet as he turned toward the long marble table where this had all started, he realized he no longer knew what that conclusion would be, because for the first time in a long time the outcome was not something he could control. And as he waited for them to return, one thought remained steady in his mind, not about what they had spent, but about what he was about to say when he faced her, because whatever came next would not just define them, it would define him. They returned just before noon, one by one, stepping back into the same room where everything had begun, but nothing felt the same anymore, because the energy had shifted from anticipation to expectation, and each of them carried something different into that space. Chloe walked in first, her presence bright, confident, as if the last 48 hours had confirmed everything she believed about herself, her arms filled with branded bags that spoke louder than words. Vanessa followed, composed and elegant, her posture perfectly aligned with the image she had built around herself, the subtle glimmer of her bracelet catching the light like proof of success. Olivia entered with measured calm, her expression unreadable, but controlled, the kind of composure that came from knowing she had played the game strategically. And then finally Amara stepped in last, her hands empty, her uniform simple, as always, as if nothing about her had changed at all. And yet everything had, because while the others carried visible results, she carried something invisible, something that could not be displayed on a table. And Ethan noticed that immediately, not just her empty hands, but the way she stood, slightly apart, not withdrawn, but grounded, like she had never expected to be part of this moment in the first place. And for a brief second the room fell quiet, the kind of silence that comes before something important is said. And Ethan took his place at the head of the table, again the same position as before, but this time it felt different, because now he was not introducing a test, he was concluding one, and that required something more than authority, it required clarity. And he looked at each of them in turn, not rushing, not avoiding, because what he was about to say mattered more than anything he had planned. When this began, let us start simple, he said, his voice steady but softer than before. Tell me what you chose. Chloe did not hesitate. She stepped forward immediately, her smile confident, her tone light, but assured. I chose to enjoy the opportunity, she said, lifting one of the bags slightly, as if it spoke for itself. I mean, that was the point, right? No limits. So I explored that. Vanessa followed with a slight nod, her voice smooth, controlled. I invested in experiences that reflect a certain level of access, she said carefully, because how you spend money says Something about where you belong. Olivia waited a moment before speaking her words. Precise, measured. I used it to build connections, opportunities that extend beyond immediate value, because long-term impact matters more than short-term satisfaction. And Ethan listened to each of them, without interruption, his expression unreadable, because none of what they said surprised him, not the confidence, not the reasoning, not even the way they justified their choices, because all of it aligned with the world he knew, the one he had built his life around. And then his gaze shifted to Amara, and for a moment, she did not speak, not because she was unsure, but because she was considering how to answer in a room where her perspective had never been the focus before. I did not really think about it like that, she said, finally, her voice quiet but steady. I just used it where it was needed, and the simplicity of that statement lingered because it did not fit the pattern of the others. It did not explain itself. It did not try to impress, and Ethan felt something tighten slightly in his chest, because this was the moment he had been preparing for, the point where observation became judgment, where data became meaning, and yet instead of clarity, he felt something else. Something closer to hesitation, and Chloe let out a small laugh, breaking the tension. Well, that is one way to put it, she said lightly, though there was an edge beneath it. Vanessa glanced at Amara briefly, her expression unreadable, while Olivia remained still, watching Ethan instead of reacting, and Ethan took a slow breath before stepping closer to the table, his hand resting lightly against its surface, because now came the part that could not be undone, the part where truth would be revealed, not just for them, but for him as well. I told you at the beginning, he said, his voice quieter, now more deliberate, that this was not about what you bought, it was about what you chose. And for the first time since they entered the room, the atmosphere shifted again, because something in his tone made it clear that what came next would not be simple. And as he reached for a remote on the table, the screens behind him flickered to life, the room filling with silent images, moments captured without their awareness, transactions translated into stories, choices made visible. And as the first clips began to play, the room grew still, because suddenly this was no longer about what they said, it was about what they had done. And Ethan watched them carefully, not the footage but their reactions, because in that moment he realized something that changed everything. The truth he had uncovered was not just about their choices, it was about whether he had the courage to accept what those choices meant. The first image that filled the room was bright, polished, almost effortless Chloe, stepping out of a boutique, her arms full, her smile wide, the kind of moment that looked perfect in every sense. And for a second, she leaned into it, lifting her chin slightly, as if the screen confirmed what she had already said. But as the clips continued, the details became harder to ignore, the rapid sequence of purchases, the way each decision flowed into the next without pause, without question, and Ethan said nothing. He simply let it play until the silence between frames became heavier than the footage itself. Then the scene shifted. Vanessa in a private spa setting, soft lighting, quiet luxury, her movements calm, controlled, everything curated, everything intentional, and again it looked right, it fit the image she had presented. But the longer it stayed on screen, the more it revealed not just what she chose, but how she chose it, with precision, with awareness, with a clear understanding of how to position herself within that world. And when the footage ended, she held her composure perfectly, though her fingers tightened slightly at her side. Olivia came next, her scenes different, sharper conversations at tables, where every word carried weight, her posture forward, her gaze steady, the kind of focus that turned opportunity into strategy. And when the final clip faded, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging that this was exactly what she had intended to show. And for a moment, it seemed like everything was unfolding as expected, until the screen went dark for a second longer than before, and when it lit again, the tone changed completely, because now there were no bright lights, no polished spaces, no carefully framed images, just a quiet grocery store aisle, Amara moving slowly, selecting items not for preference, but for purpose, her expression thoughtful, her hands steady, and the room shifted instantly, because this did not look like the others, it did not feel like the others. And as the footage continued, the contrast became undeniable, the hospital hallway, the conversation outside the clinic, the small building where she carried supplies inside, without hesitation, each moment simple, each decision unspoken, and yet together they formed something far more powerful than anything that had come before. And no one spoke, not Chloe, not Vanessa, not Olivia, because there was nothing to say that would fit inside what they were seeing, and Ethan felt it too, not as surprise anymore, but as something deeper, something that settled into place with quiet certainty, because this was the truth. He had not been ready for the part of the test that had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with character, and as the final clip played showing Amara sitting alone in that diner paying with her own cash instead of the card, the room held its breath because that moment did not make sense in any logical way, not in a world where access erased limits. And yet there it was, undeniable and real. And when the screen finally went still, Ethan did not turn to the others right away. He let the silence stay. He let it stretch until it forced everyone to sit with what they had just seen, because this was not about comparison anymore. It was about contrast, the kind that could not be explained away or justified. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, not weaker, but more deliberate, because now every word carried weight. "3 of you used the card to elevate yourselves," he said slowly, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. There is nothing surprising about that. And Chloe shifted slightly. Vanessa straightened. Olivia remained still because they understood what that meant, but Ethan did not stop there. He turned his gaze toward Amara, his expression steady, but changed in a way none of them had seen before. "One of you used it to lift others." And that is where the room changed completely, because suddenly the focus was no longer shared, it was singular, and Amara did not move. She did not step forward. She did not defend herself. She simply stood there as if she had done nothing worth attention, and that made it even more undeniable, because there was no performance in it, no expectation of recognition, and Ethan felt something shift inside him again, not confusion this time, but clarity, because the test had done exactly what it was meant to do, just not in the way he had expected it, had not confirmed his beliefs, it had challenged them. And now the only question left was whether he was willing to accept that truth out loud. And as he looked at her standing there without any of the markers the others carried, no bags, no jewelry, no visible proof of value, he understood something he had missed from the beginning. Value was never about what you could take, it was about what you chose to give, and once you saw that, you could not unsee it. No one moved at first because the weight of what had just been revealed did not leave room for immediate reaction. It settled slowly, pressing into the silence, until it became something each of them had to carry in their own way. Chloe's confidence dimmed just enough to show the crack beneath it. Vanessa's composure tightened, as if she was recalibrating. Olivia remained still, but her eyes shifted not toward the screen anymore, but toward Amara, measuring, reassessing, and Amara herself stood exactly as she had before, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression unchanged, as if none of this belonged to her at all. And that was what made it impossible to ignore, because in a room filled with people who had just been seen, she was the only one who had not tried to be. And Ethan let the silence stretch a moment longer, not out of control, but out of intention, because this part mattered more than anything he had said before. This was where meaning settled into truth, and truth required space. "You all did exactly what you thought made sense," he said finally, his voice calm, but grounded in something deeper, now something that no longer came from assumption, but from understanding. "And there is nothing wrong with that." Chloe let out a small breath, as if relieved to hear it. Vanessa lifted her chin slightly. Olivia gave a faint nod, because those words gave them something to hold on to, something that kept their choices from being dismissed. But Ethan did not look at them again. His attention remained fixed on Amara, because the rest of what he had to say was not for the room, it was for her. "You used it differently," he continued, not louder, but clearer, "and that difference matters more than anything else here." Amara blinked once, the only visible reaction she allowed, and for a moment it seemed like she might speak, but she did not, because whatever this moment was, it was not one she had prepared for. And Ethan stepped closer now, not to close the distance entirely, but enough to shift the dynamic, enough to make it clear that this was no longer about observation, it was about acknowledgement. "You were given the same access," he said, "and you did not treat it like it belonged to you. And that is the part one cannot ignore." And something in his tone changed there, not softer, not harder, but more personal, because for the first time he was not speaking as someone running an experiment, he was speaking as someone who had been changed by it. And Chloe shifted again, this time less comfortable. Vanessa's expression held, but her focus sharpened. Olivia watched closely, because she understood what was happening before anyone else did. The center of the room had moved, and it was not moving back. "Why?" he asked then, not as a challenge, not as a test, but as a genuine question. "Why did you choose that?" Amara hesitated just slightly, not because she did not have an answer, but because she was deciding whether it needed to be said out loud. "I did not think of it as mine," she said simply, and the room went still again, because that answer did not fit the scale of what had just been shown. It was too small, too quiet, and yet it carried more weight than anything else that had been said, and Ethan felt it settle Immediately, because that was the line he had been searching for, the boundary he had not understood until now, the difference between having access and claiming ownership. And once it was spoken, it changed everything, because it reframed the entire test not as a measure of spending, but as a measure of identity. And Ethan nodded slowly, not to signal agreement, but to acknowledge that he had heard it, fully understood it in a way he could not dismiss. And as he turned slightly back toward the table, the same one where this had all begun, he reached for something resting at its center, one of the black cards identical to the others, and for a moment he held it there between his fingers, looking at it not as a tool, not as a symbol of power, but as something else entirely, something that now carried a meaning he had not intended when he first placed it there. And when he looked back up at her, the decision had already been made, not impulsively, not emotionally, but with the same clarity he had always relied on, except now that clarity pointed somewhere new. This is where the test was supposed to end, he said quietly, but it is not where it should. And with that the room shifted again, not in tension this time, but in anticipation, because whatever came next was no longer part of the plan. It was something else, something none of them could predict. And for the first time since this began, Ethan was not in control of the outcome. He was choosing it. The moment lingered longer than anyone expected, because once a decision shifts from expectation to intention, it changes the air in the room in a way that cannot be undone. And Ethan Cole stood there with the black card between his fingers, not as a symbol of control anymore, but as something that now carried a different kind of weight, something quieter, something earned. And as he looked at Amara, there was no hesitation left in him, not because he had planned this outcome, but because he had finally understood it. This was never about who could spin the most, or even who could spin the smartest. It was about who understood what the card really represented, and only one person in that room had seen it clearly enough to treat it with restraint instead of entitlement. And that realization did not come with excitement, it came with clarity, the kind that settles deep and does not move once it arrives. This card, he said slowly, his voice steady, but different now, is not a reward, and it is not a test anymore. And the shift in his tone made Chloe straighten slightly. Vanessa's gaze sharpened. Olivia leaned forward just enough to catch every word, because this was no longer about explanation, this was about direction. It is an extension of trust, he continued, and that is something I do not give easily. And for a brief second the room held still, because trust was not something Ethan Cole was known for offering, not without reason, not without control. And yet here, he was redefining it in real time, and when he stepped forward, the distance between him and Amara closing just enough to make the moment unmistakably personal. I followed the movement, not because of the gesture itself, but because of what it represented, a shift in power, a shift in focus, a shift in everything they had assumed about how this would end. You said you did not think of it as yours, he said quietly, looking directly at her, and that is exactly why it should be. And with that he extended the card toward her, not as a demonstration, not as a performance, but as a simple, undeniable act. And for a moment Amara did not move, her eyes flickering from the card to him, as if searching for something unspoken, some condition, some hidden expectation that had to exist, because nothing in her life had ever come without one. And Ethan did not fill that silence. He did not explain further. He simply waited, because this time the choice had to be hers completely. And the room felt it, that pause, that space where everything could still turn in another direction. Chloe shifted again, this time unable to hide the tension in her posture. Vanessa's composure held, but only just. Olivia's gaze remained fixed, calculating, but quieter now, because even she could see that this was not a move that could be analyzed in the usual way. And slowly Amara reached out her hand, steady but careful, not hesitant, just aware. And when her fingers closed around the card, the moment landed fully, not with noise, not with reaction, but with something deeper, something final, because this was not about receiving, it was about what it meant to hold it now. And Ethan watched that small movement with more focus than anything else that had happened in the last 2 days, because this was the point where everything he believed had either been confirmed or rewritten, and he knew which one it was without needing to say it out loud. You can walk away from this, he added after a moment, his voice quieter, now not as a warning, but as a truth. You can return to exactly where you were before. None of this has to change. And that was the final layer, the one that made the offer real, because without the option to refuse, it would have been something else entirely. And Amara looked down at the card in her hand for a second longer, not in awe, not in disbelief, but in consideration, the kind that comes from understanding the weight of something beyond its surface, and when she looked back up her expression had not changed, but there was something clearer in it now, not acceptance, not excitement, but recognition. "I was never trying to change anything," she said softly, and that answer settled into the room in a way no one had expected, because it stripped the moment of ambition, it removed the idea of gain, and left only intention. And Ethan nodded slowly, not because he needed confirmation, but because he had already seen it in every choice she had made, and now he was hearing it in her words, and for the first time since this began, he felt something that had nothing to do with control or outcome, something closer to respect, the kind that cannot be manufactured, cannot be bought, cannot be forced. And as the silence returned, it was no longer heavy, it was steady, grounded in something real, because whatever this moment was, it was not the end of a test, it was the beginning of something neither of them had planned, and that was exactly why it mattered. The room did not return to normal after that moment, because something fundamental had shifted, and once a shift like that happens, it does not reverse, it settles into everything that follows, and changes the way each person understands where they stand. Chloe was the first to break the silence, but this time her voice did not carry the same effortless confidence, it held something tighter, something edged with disbelief. "So that is it," she said, glancing between Ethan and Amara. "That is all it takes, just spend it differently." And suddenly, everything changes, and the question hung in the air not because it demanded an answer, but because it revealed something underneath it, a need to make sense of what had just happened in a way that still fit the rules. She understood. Vanessa crossed her arms slightly, her expression controlled, but her tone more pointed. "It was still his money," she said carefully, as if trying to reframe the moment within a structure she could accept. "None of us were spending our own." And Olivia did not speak immediately, but her gaze shifted toward Ethan, not questioning, not challenging, but observing, because she knew this was not about the money anymore, and that made it more complicated, not less. And Ethan listened to all of it without interruption, not dismissing, not correcting, because he understood exactly what they were trying to do. They were trying to bring this back into a system where outcomes could be predicted and justified, but that system no longer applied, and he took a slow breath before responding, his voice calm, but firm, not defensive, but certain. "You are right," he said. "It was never your money, but that is not the point." And the way he said it made the difference clear, because he was not arguing, he was redefining the terms of what mattered. "The point is what you believed you had the right to do with it." And that distinction landed differently, because it shifted the focus from action to assumption, from what they did to what they thought they were allowed to do. And Chloe frowned slightly. Vanessa's posture stiffened. Olivia remained still, but more attentive now, because she could see where this was going. And Ethan continued, his gaze steady, not on all of them, but moving between them with equal weight. "When you believe something is yours, you use it to elevate yourself," he said, not as criticism, but as observation. "That is natural, that is expected. But when you understand that something is not yours, not really you, start to ask a different question, not what can I gain from this, but what should I do with it?" And the room went quiet again, because that question did not have an easy answer, not in a world built on ownership and access. And for a moment no one spoke, because each of them was forced to sit with that difference in a way they had not before. And Amara still stood there holding the card, her expression unchanged, but her presence now impossible to overlook, because she had already answered that question before it was ever asked out loud. And Ethan turned back toward her, not to isolate her, but to acknowledge what she had shown, without trying to define it further. "You did not treat it like an opportunity," he said. "You treated it like a responsibility, and that is the difference." And this time, there was no reaction from the others, no interruption, no attempt to reframe it, because the clarity of that statement left no space for it. And Ethan stepped back slightly, the distance returning, but the shift remaining, because this was no longer about who stood where, it was about what had been revealed, and what could not be ignored. "I cannot unsee what I saw," he added quietly. And that was the truth of it, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just final. Because once something is understood at that level, it does not fade, it stays, it changes how every future decision is made. And Chloe looked away, first her earlier certainty replaced by something less defined. Vanessa held her composure, but her silence now carried weight. Olivia's expression remained controlled, but her focus had shifted entirely from the outcome to the implications. And Amara said nothing at all, because she did not need to. Nothing about what she had done required explanation or defense. And Ethan let the silence settle one last time, not as tension, but as resolution, because the test had ended, but the meaning of it had just begun to take shape. and as he turned slightly toward the window, the city stretching out beyond it, unchanged in its movement, unchanged in its noise, he understood something with a clarity that surprised. Even in power had never been about what you could control, it was about what you chose to do when control was no longer the point. And now, standing in a room where that truth had been made undeniable, he knew that whatever came next would not follow the same rules he had always relied on, and that was not uncertainty anymore, it was direction. The conversation did not end when the words stopped, because what had been said remained suspended in the room, shaping the silence that followed, and for a moment no one moved, as if stepping away too quickly would undo something that had just been understood for the first time. Chloe was the one who finally turned toward the door, her earlier certainty replaced by something quieter, something she could not quite define, and without another word she walked out, her heels echoing softly against the floor, not with the same rhythm as before, but slower, more measured, as if each step carried a thought she had not expected to have. Vanessa followed shortly after, her posture still composed, but her expression tighter, her usual sense of control no longer complete, because while she had not been wrong, she had not been right either, and that distinction lingered in a way she could not easily dismiss. Olivia remained a moment longer, her gaze steady on Ethan, not questioning, not resisting, but observing as she always did, because she understood something the others did not. This was not just a shift in outcome, it was a shift in perspective, and that had consequences far beyond this room. And when she finally nodded once, it was not agreement, it was acknowledgement. Before she turned and left, as well, leaving only two people standing in the space where everything had been revealed, and for a brief moment the quiet felt different, not heavy, not tense, just still, and Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of the last 48 hours settling into something more defined now that the noise had faded, and he glanced at Amara, who had not moved from where she stood, the card still in her hand, as if she had not yet decided what it meant to keep it, or even if she should, and that hesitation did not come from doubt, it came from awareness, the kind that does not assume anything without understanding it first. You can put it away, he said after a moment, his tone no longer formal, no longer measured in the same way as before, just direct, simple. You do not have to stand there like it is temporary. And Amara looked down at the card again, her fingers shifting slightly against its surface before she slipped it into her pocket, not with urgency, not with excitement, just with quiet acceptance, like placing something where it belonged, even if she was not entirely sure why. And when she looked back up, there was a question in her eyes, not spoken, but present, because while everything else had been made clear, this part had not. Why me? She asked finally, her voice calm, but genuine, not searching for validation, just for understanding. And Ethan did not answer immediately, not because he did not have an answer, but because he wanted to choose it carefully, because this was not a question about preference, it was a question about meaning, because you did not change when the situation did, he said at last, and the simplicity of that answer carried more weight than anything else he could have said. Most people adjust, they respond, they become something different depending on what is in front of them, but you stayed the same, and that is rare. And Amara held his gaze for a second longer, as if measuring that response against her own understanding of herself, because from where she stood she had not done anything unusual, she had only done what made sense, and that difference between perception and reality lingered quietly between them. I just did what I would have done anyway, she said, and Ethan nodded, because that was exactly the point, that was what made it matter, because if nothing changed then everything about it was real. And he turned slightly toward the window again, the city still moving beneath them, unchanged, unaware of the shift that had just taken place above it, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because there was no need to fill the space with more words when the meaning was already there, clear and steady. And then Ethan did something he had not planned to do, not part of the test, not part of the outcome, just something that felt necessary. Now what are you going to do with it? He asked, and this time the question was not theoretical, it was not part of a framework, it was real, directed at her, without expectation, without pressure, just curiosity. And Amara considered it, not quickly, not impulsively, because this was not a decision she would make lightly, not because of the card itself, but because of what it represented now. I will use it the same way I used it before, she said after a moment, her voice steady, her expression unchanged. And that answer did not surprise him, it confirmed something he already knew, and yet hearing it out loud grounded it in a way that observation alone could not. And Ethan allowed a small breath to leave him, not relief, not satisfaction, just recognition. Because whatever came next would not need to be controlled, it would simply need to be allowed. And as the quiet settled around them, once more he understood something with complete clarity. This was never about finding the right person, it was about recognizing them when they were already there. The city outside did not pause for what had just happened inside that penthouse office. It continued in its steady rhythm of movement and noise, unaware that something quiet but significant had shifted between two people standing far above it. And for the first time since the test began, there was no structure guiding what came next, no timeline, no rules, no defined outcome, just a moment that neither of them had planned, and that made it more real than anything that had come before. Ethan remained by the window for a few seconds longer, his reflection faint against the glass, the same man who had started this experiment, but no longer carrying the same assumptions. And when he turned back toward Amara, the distance between them felt different, not smaller, not larger, just clearer, like the roles that had once defined them had quietly stepped aside and left something more honest in their place. "You do not have to come back tomorrow," he said after a moment, his voice calm but direct, not dismissing, not offering permission, just stating a truth. This was never a job requirement, and Amara understood what he meant immediately, because beneath the words was a choice, one that extended beyond the card, one that reached into how she defined her place in this space. And for a second, she considered it, not with hesitation, but with awareness, because everything about her life had been built on consistency, on showing up, on doing what was expected. And now, for the first time, she was being told that expectation did not apply in the same way anymore. "I was not coming back for the job," she replied quietly, and that answer landed with a different kind of clarity, because it stripped away the assumption that had been sitting between them since the beginning. And Ethan watched her carefully, not analyzing, not measuring, just listening, because there was nothing to interpret, only something to understand. "Then why come back?" he asked, and this time the question was not about curiosity alone, it was about direction, because whatever answer she gave would shape what this moment became. "I wanted to finish what you started," she said simply, and there was no challenge in her tone, no accusation, just a statement that acknowledged the weight of what had happened over the last 2 days. And for a brief second Ethan let that settle, because she was right. This had been his doing, his structure, his test, and yet the outcome had not followed his design, and that was something he had to accept fully, not partially, not conveniently, but completely. "You did finish it," he said after a moment, and that was the truth of it, not because the time had run out, but because the purpose had been fulfilled, and there was nothing left to prove. And Amara gave a small nod, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement, because she understood that too, even if the meaning of it had not been clear until now. And the silence that followed was not empty, it was steady, grounded in something that did not need to be filled with more explanation, because both of them already knew what had changed. The only question left was what to do with it. And Ethan took a step closer, not enough to impose, not enough to close the space completely, just enough to make it clear that what he was about to say mattered. "There is something else," he said, and this time there was no formality in his tone, no distance, just intention, because whatever came next was not part of the original plan. It was something new, something he had not anticipated when he first placed those cards on the table. "I do not need someone to spend money," he continued slowly. "I need someone who understands what it means to use it." And the weight of that statement shifted the moment again, because it introduced something beyond the test, something that extended into the future. And Amara felt it, not as pressure, but as possibility, the kind that did not come with guarantees, but with direction. "What are you asking?" she said, and Ethan did not answer immediately, not because he was uncertain, but because he wanted to be clear about what he was offering and what he was not. "This is not a position," he said finally, "not a role you step into and follow instructions. This is something you help shape." And that distinction mattered, because it removed the hierarchy that had existed between them from the beginning. It was no longer employer and employee, it was something else, something undefined, but real. "I have resources," he continued, "and you have something I cannot." By perspective, and that word lingered, because it captured everything that had been revealed without reducing it to a simple explanation. And Amara considered it, not quickly, not impulsively, because this was not about accepting or declining, it was about understanding what it would mean to step into something without a clear outline, without a guarantee of what it would become. And for the first time since this began, the decision in front of her was not about what to do with the card, it was about what to do with the opportunity that had come with it. "I would not do it your way," she said after a moment, her voice steady, her gaze direct, and Ethan almost smiled, not because it challenged him, but because it confirmed something he had already begun to understand. "That was exactly the point," he replied quietly, because if you did it would not work, and the simplicity of that exchange settled into the space between them, because it removed the need for negotiation, the need for alignment in the traditional sense. This was not about agreement, it was about recognition, and as the light from the window shifted slightly, casting a softer tone across the room, Ethan realized something that would have been impossible for him to accept just 2 days earlier. Control had never been the foundation of what he was building, it had only been the limitation, and now standing there with someone who had shown him a different way to see it, he understood that letting go of that control was not a risk, it was the only way forward, and Amara stood there holding that realization in her own way, not as a conclusion, but as the beginning of something she had not expected. And as the city continued to move beyond the glass, neither of them rushed the moment, because some decisions are not meant to be made quickly, they are meant to be understood first, and for the first time since this began, both of them were willing to take the time to do exactly that. The next morning did not feel like a continuation, it felt like a quiet beginning, the kind that does not announce itself, but settles into place before anyone fully realizes it. And the city outside moved the same, as always, taxis cutting through traffic, people crossing streets with purpose, buildings reflecting the early light. But inside Ethan Cole's office, something had shifted into a different rhythm, not slower, not faster, just more deliberate. And when the door opened, it was not with hesitation, but with intention. Amara stepped in without her cleaning cart, without the cloth in her hand, just herself, standing in the same space that had once defined her role, but no longer did. And Ethan looked up from the desk, not surprised, not questioning, because somewhere between the last conversation and this moment, he had already understood that she would come back, not out of obligation, but because she had decided to, and that difference mattered more than anything else. You came, he said simply, and she gave a small nod, not as confirmation, but as acknowledgement of a choice that had already been made. I said I would use it the same way, she replied, her voice steady, and the card rested in her hand, not hidden, not displayed, just present like a tool rather than a symbol. And Ethan stood slowly, not to take control of the moment, but to meet it halfway, because what they were building now did not follow the same structure as before. There was no script for this, no predefined outcome, only direction. Then we start there, he said, and those words carried a different kind of weight, not the authority of a command, but the clarity of a beginning. And as they moved through the space together, it became immediately clear that the dynamic had changed, not in a dramatic way, not in something that could be pointed to directly, but in the absence of what had once been there. No hierarchy, no performance, no expectation of roles being fulfilled, just two people standing in the same room, with a shared understanding that had been earned rather than assigned. The first place they went was not a boardroom, not a meeting filled with advisors. It was the same building in Queens, the one that had appeared in the transactions, the one that had quietly anchored so many of Amara's choices. And as they stepped inside, the air felt different from the polished silence of the penthouse. It carried voices, movement, life, the kind of space where things were needed, not displayed. And Ethan noticed it immediately, not as an outsider observing, but as someone seeing something he had overlooked for far too long. This is where you started, he said, not as a question, but as recognition. And Amara nodded, because this was not new to her, this was familiar, this was the world she understood before any of this had begun. People here do not ask for much, she said quietly, they just need someone to notice. And that sentence settled into him in a way that no report, no data ever had, because it was not information, it was perspective. And as they moved further inside, people greeted her not with surprise, not with formality, but with warmth, with recognition that had nothing to do with status and everything to do with presence. And Ethan watched that closely, not analyzing, not measuring, just understanding. Because this was what he had missed, this was what no amount of wealth had ever shown him before, connection that did not depend on what you had, but on what you gave of yourself. And when they stepped back outside later, the city felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had. And Amara looked at him, then, not waiting for instruction, not asking what came next, just present. And Ethan realized something with complete certainty. There was no longer a need to define this in the way he once would have, no need to structure it into something controlled, because the value of it came from allowing it to grow naturally from the choices they made together. So what now? He asked, and this time the question was not about direction, it was about partnership. And Amara considered it for a moment, her gaze moving briefly across the street, where people passed without noticing them the same way they had passed her countless times before. We keep going, she said simply, and the clarity of that answer left no room for complication, because it was not about building something grand all at once. It was about continuing what had already begun, one choice at a time. And Ethan nodded slowly, not because he needed to agree, but because he understood that this was the only way forward, not through control, not through design, but through consistency, through intention, through the same quiet decisions that had changed everything over the last 48 hours. And as they stood there for a moment longer, the city, moving around them, unchanged in its pace, unchanged in its noise, the meaning of what had happened settled fully into place, because this had never been about the cards, or the test, or even the outcome. It had been about recognizing something real in a world that often rewards what only looks real. And now that it had been found, neither of them had any reason to let it go. And as they stepped forward together, not into something defined, but into something chosen, the path ahead did not need to be explained, because for the first time it did not need to be controlled. It only needed to be lived.